Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, original link, top of the description, extra history. Now, I haven't seen an extra history video in a while, but it's Mutiny on the Bounty, and I love the movies. There are three versions that I know of, all with really good actors playing the main parts. I believe, was it Humphrey Bogart or something who played in the first one? And then the second one in the 60s, I think, was played by Marlon Brando. And then the third one in, I want to say the late 80s, was played by, or mid 80s, was played by Mel Gibson, and Anthony Hopkins was the antagonist. So I love the movies. The one with Marlon Brando is my favorite, and I love the story. So epic history, extra history has a video on it. Let's watch it right now. Hope everyone's doing well. Original link, top of the description.
April 28th, 1789, 35 miles south of Tofua, Tonga. William Bligh, commanding lieutenant of His Majesty's armed vessel Bounty, awakens with pistols leveled at him and a cutlass in his face. Then his hands are bound and he's dragged on deck, surrounded by jeering members of his crew. Bligh is naked except for a shirt, but the greatest indignity is the man who's dragging him. Knock him down, Bligh orders, trying to talk sense to his sailors. Knock Christian down! The man dragging him shoves Bligh around roughly and points a bayonet at his neck. This is acting Lieutenant Fletcher Christian. Bligh had been his mentor for years, taught him the sailor's craft, and personally invited him on this voyage to the edge of the known world. And in return, Christian has taken his ship and is about to load Bligh and his loyalists on a boat and cut them adrift in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Practically a death sentence. Now, why these friends turned into enemies is far from clear even centuries later. But what is certain is that this moment is the start of one of the most infamous episodes in all of naval history. A story of exploration and endurance, of personal drama, exploitation, and a deadly manhunt in uncharted waters. This, my history-loving friends, is the tale of the Mutiny on the Bounty.
If I remember correctly, which I should since I've seen multiple versions of the movie, and I've seen them a few times, is that going from Great Britain, they're sailing down south through the Atlantic, and then they have to decide whether to go the long way through around southern Africa or the shorter way, but much more dangerous way of around the southern tip of South America, where the seas are notoriously very rough. And their journey is not really an important one. It's just to go to pick up some plants or some plants that I believe are supposed to be used to grow for food for slaves in a British colony in the Caribbean Sea. So it's not a very important trip, but it's obviously the mutiny that makes the story so famous.
This tale of high seas betrayal is brought to you by Ground News, whose service would have been super helpful had it existed during the time of Bounty. December 23rd, 1787, Spithead, England, 16 months earlier. The HMS Bounty clears port, embarking on a voyage of scientific endeavor, discovery, and commerce. A mission to collect unfamiliar plants in the newly explored Pacific and use them to feed an empire. A voyage to a place so remote at the time that the only modern equivalent would be a mission to space. And on the quarterdeck stands William Bligh, with his new voyage beginning much later than anticipated. See, the HMS Bounty had left Greenwich on October 15th, but due to foul weather, only reached Spithead on November 4th. Then, Bligh sat 3 weeks waiting for his official orders, which was especially frustrating because their destination was the Kingdom of Tahiti, and the fastest route there was to round the southern tip of South America.
I believe this is how Pitcairn Island is found as well.
But that route was only possible in the short southern summer, and the delay risked the voyage missing the safe weather window. Though there were problems on the ship as well. Despite being a high-profile and prestigious voyage, the Admiralty had severely under-resourced the Bounty mission. Bligh would only make 1/6 his previous salary.
I thought it was the opposite of a high-profile and prestigious voyage. I thought it was the opposite of that, But again, I've only seen movies. I'm going to stop repeating myself.
Under-resourced the bounty mission. Bligh would only make 1/6 his previous salary as a merchant captain, and the bounty itself was small. A converted coal ship, it measured only 90 feet long and 24 abeam, not quite half the size of Captain Cook's Pacific exploration ship HMS Resolution. In fact, conditions on board Bounty were so tight, Bligh huffily referred to the vessel as a chamber pot, and that was before much of it was converted to serve as a plant nursery. Right you are, Zoe. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take a step back. See, the American Revolution had created a major problem for the British Empire. Much of English manufacturing consisted of the textile trade, which was dependent on cheap cotton imports from the American South. But now that America was no longer a colony subject to price controls, imperial thinkers had decided to make the British West Indies the new site for cheap cotton cultivation. Though converting the Caribbean to cotton production would mean expanding its population of enslaved Africans.
I thought that the Caribbean colonial outposts in the Caribbean were actually more lucrative than the American colonies in modern day United States of America, East Coast. But I guess that was more in sugarcane. And so when it comes to cotton, yeah, I'm sure the American colonies for the British provided most of that. So still makes sense.
More people meant a cotton production would mean expanding its population of enslaved Africans. More people meant a greater need for food, but that was already proving a problem, because local staples like plantain and maize were vulnerable to hurricanes. And when America revolted, the disruption of food imports also caused a hunger crisis. But Joseph Banks, the naturalist who had accompanied Captain Cook, had a solution: Tahitian breadfruit. It was hardy, it required practically no tending, and it gave 3 crops a year. I mean, come on. So that was William Bligh's mission: go to Tahiti and collect over 1,000 breadfruit plants to bring to the West Indies. On the way, he would also chart unexplored Pacific routes. Meanwhile, his presence would also contest France's claim to Tahiti. But to outfit the ship for this special mission, Bligh had to give up the great cabin, usually reserved for the captain's quarters, to become essentially a garden. It had special potholders, a ceiling grill to let in sunlight, and a system to collect water for reuse after watering the young trees. This, of course, only made the space problems for humans worse. But still, even with the frustrating delays, the cramped conditions, and Bligh's low salary, honestly, he was still in quite high spirits when the Bounty left England. Because Bligh had wanted this mission, believing his destiny lay in the Pacific. Bligh was an experienced sailor who'd first gone to sea at 7 as a cabin boy and won promotion to lieutenant after his service in the Battle of Dogger Bank and the Great Siege of Gibraltar. But his crowning glory had been serving as master on the HMS Resolution during Cook's 3rd Pacific voyage. In fact, he'd personally seen Cook clubbed to death by native Hawaiian warriors. We discussed Cook in our Exploring the Pacific series, but his death is actually a story that's so complicated and nuanced it deserves its own episode. We'll get to it one day. After Cook's death, Bligh had been responsible for much of the navigation that brought the expedition back home, especially since Cook's second-in-command died of tuberculosis as they surveyed the coast of the Pacific Northwest. And now, Bligh saw the Bounty mission as a second grab at Pacific glory. But he'd been given a small 46-man crew, and a particularly young group. At 33, Bligh was one of the older men on the ship, plus 2 of the expedition were civilian botanists, called gardeners, brought to care for the trees. So Bligh seasoned the crew by sprinkling in a few other veterans of Cook's voyages who spoke Tahitian and had Pacific experience.
Wait, he was 33? He looks about 50 to 60 in the movie adaptations.
Meanwhile, the youngest members of the group essentially got their positions by nepotism. Bligh picked Thomas Hayward as one of his midshipmen, the lowest officer rank often held by early teenagers, because the boy's sister was a friend of his wife. Then the similarly named teenage aristocrat Peter Haywood, oh, that's not going to get confusing at all in this story, similarly was a friend of Bligh's in-laws. In fact, Haywood was among a group of young gentlemen who came aboard to get naval experience, and who held the same social status as midshipmen while not having a military rank. Actually, this bears talking about, because unless you are deep into the world of 18th century British military like Rob is, you might be like me and not realize something. The Royal Navy essentially structured its ranks around the rigid British class system. It didn't matter if you were a 30-year-old able seaman who'd been on ships for 20 years, you still had to listen to the pimple-faced midshipman who'd gotten aboard yesterday. Officers, and to a lesser extent, warrant officers like the Bounty's master John Fryer, were of a higher social class from crewmen. They had separate areas for eating and sleeping. They weren't allowed to fraternize with the men, dressed entirely differently, and often were literally above them, since only they were allowed to use the raised quarterdeck at the ship's stern. So these random scientists and young gentlemen that didn't have military ranks were still treated like officers, because as gentlemen, they were considered above the seamen. They were essentially interns treated with respect of officers because one day they would become officers, etc., etc. And among these young gentlemen was Bligh's favorite pick, Fletcher Christian. The men had met in the merchant service 2 years before and immediately formed a bond of mentorship. Bligh had even taught Christian how to navigate and invited him to his house to play with his children. You see, Christian was from a rich family who had fallen on hard times and had also gone to sea quite late. His first appointment as a cabin boy was at age 17, when the average age was between 9 and 12. But Christian was charismatic and handsome, with a penchant for getting into trouble on shore involving women. Though he was technically a young gentleman, Bligh quickly made him master's mate. So this was the merry crew that set off toward Tahiti on the HMS Bounty, its officers crammed into small cabins to accommodate the breadfruit load. Yet it wasn't all bad, because Bligh was set on emulating his hero, James Cook, who had always set great store in keeping punishments light and giving his men citrus in order to ward off scurvy. Heck, at the commencement of this voyage, Bligh even made a public statement that his goal was not a single flogging or case of scurvy. So that's positive, right? Well, yes and no, because Bligh's health measures actually became the first rift between he and his crew. And that's kinda because he was trying to be James Cook. Okay, see, the thing about Cook is that he was, James flippin' Cook. By the time Bligh sailed with them, Cook was already a renowned and respected national hero and had a personal charisma that Bligh simply lacked. I mean, when Cook asked you to do something, you just did it kind of because you wanted to. You wanted the dude to like you. But on the other hand, if you were rolling up William Bligh as a D&D character, for instance, let's just say charisma would have been his dump stat. Like intelligence off the charts, and sure, an 18 constitution, but socially fluent, not so much. First off, Bligh swore like, well, a f***ing sailor, which to be fair was what he'd been all his life. And while he wanted to avoid using the lash, the former merchant sailors of his crew were unused to the verbal abuse that was fairly common in naval life. When Bligh dressed you down for doing something wrong, he made it sting, but then sort of also forgot about it immediately, whereas his younger subordinates
not a good trait.
Tendency to stew in it. His health and hygiene measures also bordered on obsessive. Even with strenuous sea duties, the lack of exercise on ships often proved detrimental to physical fitness. So Bligh hired a blind fiddle player on the crew and insisted that the sailors dance, often for 3 hours a day after finishing duty. In retaliation, the alcoholic ship's doctor.
So I'm noticing a bit, so I'm going to bring up the movies quite a bit here, all right, just because I love the movies and they pertain to this thing. And I'm kind of getting it mixed up with a few things from the movie Master and Commander, starring, what's his name, from Gladiator and Robin Hood. What's his name? Maximus? You know what I'm talking about, I think. Where in that movie, there was more of a, like, you shouldn't fraternize with the crew, and that was explained most thoroughly in a scene where one of the younger officers kind of sang along with the crew for a second, who were singing like a song, and then they all looked at him strangely, and he ended up offing himself by jumping into the water with a cannonball. And also, they seem to have a similar reverence for the one-armed guy, Trafalgar. What's his name? Not Cook. I can't believe I'm missing on his name. I'm getting, but some of the inconsistencies I'm seeing from what I learned in the movie is that, one, the captain was portrayed as very old, as like at least 50, at least. Okay. And we're here, he's 33. And here, obviously, is more accurate than the movie. The movie's a movie. The movies are movies. This is talking about the real history. And also, it seemed like they were portrayed as more... The captain was portrayed as more kind of angry and hostile from the get-go. And so... And he didn't seem as opposed to using the whip, for instance.
Day after finishing duty. In retaliation, the alcoholic ship's doctor started to give out sick leave to sailors who wanted out of it, claiming they had scurvy, a diagnosis chosen specifically to spite Bligh. But you know, there were some upsides to the lieutenant's regime as well. For instance, he divvied up the ship into 3 watches instead of the usual 2, which allowed every man to get a full night's sleep. So overall, morale did remain high on the voyage to Tahiti, even when stormy winds forced them to abandon rounding South America and instead take a 7,000-mile detour around Africa. Bligh, who had been denied a purser by the Admiralty and therefore had to personally make decisions about food rationing, started to keep an eagle eye on the ship's stores in order to ensure they had enough food. Nevertheless, the men were excited to see the land they called Otaheite, and Bligh's relationship with Christian at this point remained strong. In fact, actually a little too strong if you ask me. It definitely smacked of favoritism. At first, Christian, who, remember, came aboard as an unranked gentleman, was merely a master's mate, assisting ship's master Jonathan Fryer with navigation. But while at sea, Bligh promoted Christian to acting lieutenant, making him second in command and demoting Fryer to third. Then at a port in Africa, Bligh lent Christian...
Okay. Another thing the movie is lying to me about is that they did end up taking the route south of South America. And that was a big, like, wait, what the hell is going on? Is he crazy? Moment in the film was that they did go through Cape Horn, or is that the south of South America, to get to the Pacific. Man, those movies took a lot of historical liberty. Huh.
Money, demoting Fryer to third.
Which makes me more happy that I'm watching this, by the way.
Then at a port in Africa, Bligh lent Christian money, a financial arrangement which may have injected tension into their relationship. Oh, and after said pit stop, Christian was also among the men who wrote into the... Bligh lent Christian money, a financial arrangement which may have injected tension into their relationship. Oh, and after said pit stop, Christian was also among the men who reported to sick call with syphilis. Yet, despite these small irritants and the long voyage, the HMS Bounty did reach Tahiti on October 26, 1788, 10 months after setting sail. It was, it turned out, a place they would be for a while. You see, soon after arriving and getting permission from the king, the gardeners informed Bligh that to ensure the 1,015 breadfruit plants would survive the voyage, they'd need to spend several months growing in the earth that they'd been transplanted in. How many months exactly? Oh, 5 months.
Whoa.
Okay, all right. Well, yeah, you know, what do you suppose a bunch of young cooped up sailors get up to in Tahiti for 5 months, a place where the sexual culture is a bit looser than they are used to? Well, actually, to be fair, quite a bit more than you might think. Yes, of course, many sailors formed partnerships with Tahitian women, though how those women looked upon this is open to interpretation. Some, like Christian, even made these partnerships despite knowing they had syphilis. But yeah, welcome to European exploration in the Pacific, and some dudes just being awful in general. But while many retellings of this story do like to focus on these sexy sexual aspects, that wasn't really the only notable element of their stay. The Bounty crew were living among the Tahitians, learning new skills around navigation, agriculture, and fishing. They were also coming to understand a climate that was, you know, to put it mildly, a little bit more pleasant than rainy, cold, misty England. And they were, many for the first time, experiencing a society different from the hierarchical power relationships of the British class system.
Another thing I always think about is absence of instant communication, which I will continue to hold as maybe the biggest technological upgrade in the history of humans. It's just random stuff like this, where it's just like, hey, we got to send our people down there to get those plants we need. Oh, well, they actually need like 5 more months to grow. Okay, we'll wait a bit then. Stuff like that, which I just can't imagine anymore when we live in a world with instant communication. You know, it just, everything changes when you don't have instant or very, very quick communication.
A thing that was probably all the monarchical power relationships of the British class system. A thing that was probably all the more shocking because they just experienced Navy life, which operated on an even more rigid structure. Of course, Tahitian culture had...
So now returning to that structure might be...
its classes and status relationships, but as guests, these may have appeared invisible to the crew. Tahitian politics operated by different rules, meaning sexual freedom wasn't the only kind of liberation that they were experiencing. It was inevitable that a few crew members would try to desert, 3 of them to be precise. And when they turned themselves in, Bligh had to administer a measure he wanted to avoid, the lash. But there were more reasons than desertion to be unhappy with this crew. Bligh felt that in the 5 months ashore, they'd become lax and dissolute. They'd neglected basic ship maintenance. And upon inspecting the hold, Bligh became furious when he found that the spare sails had not been aired and were developing mold by the time they were ready to leave. And the...
Why not force them to always sleep on the ships? You know? Yeah.
Crew carefully loaded the breadfruit mold by the time they were ready to leave, and the crew carefully loaded the breadfruit plants into the converted great cabin. Bligh was starting to seethe over lapses and provocations, both real and imagined, causing the crew in turn to christen him with a new name, the Bounty Bastard. But nevertheless, the HMS Bounty set sail from Tahiti on April 4th, 1789. 24 days later,
there's nothing worse than maybe nothing worse is too much. I'm just going to use it. There's nothing worse than a leader who acts lax for a long time and internally gets frustrated only for that to boil up and explode. And so you go from lax to insanely strict. And that's on the leader's fault. You should know that allowing that is going to make them more lax, and then just exploding one time is going to make you look pretty bad. So
the mutiny would begin, and the events would be 1789. 24 days later, the mutiny would begin, and the events would be sensationalized for years to come. Of course, sensationalism is something we still live with today, even in our current times nautical news. For example, take these headlines.
His voice really fits him. I don't like. A lot of the times I'll watch channels where I hear them a lot and then I see them. His voice fits
Trump
kind of what I
US
imagine.
Ships should be allowed to travel through the Panama and Suez canals for free. Thanks to today's sponsor, Ground News, I can see that it's been reported by...
I'm going to watch through a bit of this, at least until I see the sponsors and whatnot, guys. It's a great video. I'm going to keep bringing up the... just because I love the movies, especially the one with Marlon Brando, the 60s version. And so I'm going to bring up those a lot. So sorry if that's a bit annoying to you guys. I'm not focusing more on the history than the movie. But if you're going to watch through this and you're interested in ground news, just make sure to use the promo codes and links provided by Extra History, please.
Over 200 news outlets
Original
by
link,
the
top
left, right, and
description.
center, which is super handy when I'm trying to compare everything and cut through all the noise. Ground News, of course, is a website and app designed to help you pull back the curtain on media bias. Every day they collect thousands of news articles and organize them by showing you exactly how news stories are being covered and compare ways different news organizations cover the same topic from all across the political spectrum. And they achieve this with a super handy visual breakdown of every story's political bias.
I appreciate this a lot, especially this part, but I think the middle of this bias chart should be much more scarce. Like, I feel like this column and this column should be the big ones, and then the middle one and the outer one should be about as prevalent, and then a lot more in here, because I don't think a lot of these are perfectly middle aisle, like Axios or BBC News, maybe. But yeah.
And they achieve this with a super handy visual breakdown of every story's political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source reporting. That last one, I think, is very, 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 very important, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. And if I could swing back to that story about Trump wanting to freeload through the Panama and Suez canals, not only can I see all of the news outlets and their bias...
His voice fits him perfectly, I'm sorry, but like it just like, that's exactly how I imagined you
I
looking.
can even compare headlines to see how these biases
Great
might
channel,
affect
obviously.
framing, right? So, for example, one headline from a right-leaning publication states, Trump calls for free passage of U.S. ships through Panama-Suez Canal, while on the left, a headline reads, Trump demands free passage for ships crossing Panama-Suez canals. And with Ground News, you can see all of the specific differences between the left and right's reporting, and they even have something called a blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum.
That'd be a great idea for a channel that comes up. Maybe I'll make a news channel. I don't know. But to use the blind spot feed from Ground to cover stories on a YouTube channel or some other news, like a news platform, to cover things that a lot of other people don't cover. You know, I think that'd be a good idea.
Which I find just super helpful in discerning what folks outside my usual news bubbles are talking about. Seriously, Ground News is an incredibly useful tool for sifting through the tons of daily misinformation and bias we have to deal with on the regular now, making the media landscape more transparent than ever. So if that seems useful to you, we can get you
that promo code
40% off a Ground News Vantage subscription by going to ground.news/extra via the link below or the...
Make sure, guys, if you're interested in this, love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. Thanks for watching with me. If you're interested in Ground News and heard it here watching with me, Extra History, make sure to use the promo codes and links, the /extra. It's just fair, and you're going to get a discount as well. So hope everyone's doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below. And I hope I'll see you guys next time. We'll keep on learning. Bye, guys.